Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to our third installment of Culture and Cultural Anthropology. Um, let's go ahead and jump right into it, huh? Okay. So, we're going to pick up where we left off, talking about a little bit about Gertz and what was sort of left out in this more modern approach towards ethnographic research, right? So one of the things that we have to consider is that with each progression of ethnographic study, things changed, right? When we first looked at Boas and Malinowski, their their look at anthropology was unique and open as it had been before. A lot of anthropologists were looking to justify certain types of behavior, certain ideologies. And what these two original anthropologists did was look at different cultures as unique, as special unto themselves, and not necessarily needing to be compared for for various reasons and purposes that society had already deemed. And a lot of these ideas came from some pretty basic ideas centered around things like racism and justifying laws and behavior towards a certain group of people, and having the scientific background to justify it, right? And so these guys were kind of bucking the system. They were saying, like, this isn't how we should be looking at other cultures. We should be looking at them independently. Gertz comes along, does even more of a deep dive, but one of the things that he doesn't really link to our systems of power, right? And that becomes really important for us, and we'll talk more about systems of power later on, but we kind of need to understand what power actually is and how it gets used, right? So when we think about power, what is it? So it's essentially the ability to create or influence change within a community, however large or small that community is. Now that's a pretty basic statement, right? The capability of creating change. And when we think about power in our own society, we see it in lots of different places. We see it in politics, we see it in education, we see it in the media, people having influence, people having followers, right? And by having that gives you that influence so that the things that you say can impact other people's lives. Now, power also sort of stems into this concept of martial power as well, right? The capability of forcing someone to do something. And that can look different in different ways, and we'll talk about that in a sec. Power can be wielded by an individual, right? We oftentimes see that in politics, especially if we look at sort of the major politicians of our time. Certainly right now, if you're looking at Democrats and Joe Biden, or Republicans and Donald Trump, then you have these sort of iconic individuals that are leading that that cultural influence and has that capability of having that power as an individual. Then we see groups, right? Again, those groups can be small to large, political organizations, outreach organizations, any group of people that are trying to hold sway over someone else. That also includes things like religious institutions, going to church and having people within that church have influence over you and your behavior. Same way with education, and as again, another institution, but it's not just as an institution, but it's the people within, right? Folks like me, right? As being a professor and telling you things, I'm influencing you to believe a certain thing, to think about like, oh yeah, I was told this once and now I believe it, or I don't believe it, right? It all depends on the context. Power can be used through dialogue, right? Through information dissemination, how we get the word out, right? And how do we do that? So that's really important to think about as to how that information flows, right? That's why media is so important. Power is done through dialogue, through information dissemination, through force, and through the threat of force, right? So that's, again, going into that martial state of the military or police, right? Having that influence. That also means force can be seen like through economics or politics, right? Creating laws that are then enforced. Okay. Through this process, we create varying degrees of hierarchy within a society. And we can look for those hierarchies to see, again, who has that cultural influence and who doesn't. So oftentimes you sort of see the creation of the haves and the have-nots, right? Those that have that influence, that power, and those that lack it. And oftentimes with those connections is also goes along with like resources, right? Access to food, access to education, access to healthcare, access to representation, right? All of those things are connected to power and how it's organized and how it's used, right? How it's consumed, right? If we look at the power structure, say, at a university, right? There's the relationship between the student and the instructor and the senior faculty and the department, right? The department and the university, and then the university within the larger community outside of it, because they're all interconnected, and they all sort of work together, but in different ways to get that information out there. And that information is power. That education creates influence. That influence then creates policy. That policy, will change people's lives, right? So, you might be thinking, oh, I'm just in here to get a class so I can get a good job. But that actually isn't just the only story when it comes to education and the big influence it can have on a larger scale. So we've talked a little bit about how it creates an imbalance between people, and this oftentimes looks like resources or privileges, and these are also focused like advantages. We'll talk about things like white privilege and stuff like that later on in the semester, but it's those sort of things that are given to a group of people, a community, that is what is available, determined by that community. So if you live in a poor part of town, then your access to resources, access to jobs, access to education is going to be lacking. And that can due specifically to where you were born, right? And this is important to understand, is that power can be directly related to the conditions in which you were born, your skin color, your gender, your sexuality, your ethnicity, right? Your access to education. All of those things can be directly related to, the conditions of your birth, and it has nothing to do with you as an individual, right? But it's all culture-based. So we have to understand that, those things are a big part of power, right? And how that power then gets used, how resources are distributed to those areas, right? For example, let's take education and things like standardized testing. Okay, so for a very long time, and in a lot of places it's still the case, um, standardized testing was used for schools to determine, especially if you're in high school, um, or even elementary schools, whether or not your student body was meeting expectations. Now, one of the interesting things that was happening is that schools that tested better got more funding to do better. Schools that didn't do well testing were not given more funding. And this seems sort of an opposing way of looking at things, right? You would think that if you were not getting the testing and things done, that you would want to improve that by throwing more money at it so they can get better resources, better teachers, better, and maybe not even better teachers, but having teachers want to do their job because they're actually getting paid more to do it and become more invested. More computers, better books, more after-school programs to encourage students to do more stuff, right? But because in our society, especially when standardized testing was really developed, we were still pretty racist around the country, right? And that was a way to justify and to legally put more funds towards schools that had better education, which was oftentimes schools that had been segregated that were primarily white, and the schools that didn't do well, which were typically minority schools, wouldn't get the funding. So it created, again, a barrier between different groups of people based off of their geographical location, their ethnicity, their race, all of those things. And it helped to maintain that structure of power. Okay, so when we think about how power can be used, sometimes it can be done in really complicated, ingenious, or insidious ways. But keep in mind that power itself is never fixed, right? It is constantly changing, especially within our own society, recognizing all the things that we are seeing, we are doing. New generations are coming into power, and by doing that, all of a sudden, now they're changing how things work. And this happens with every generation, right? There's some sort of a power shift that takes place. Within ours, we've seen huge shifts in power within, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years. And that's pretty unique to a country that is as diverse as the United States is, especially when it comes to diversity of thought, diversity of education, and the diversity of its people. So, yeah, there's lots of different reasons how that power can change. Culture isn't just a set of beliefs and norms held by people, but it includes institutions that help uphold those ideas. So when we think about power, our education system upholds certain ideologies about how we should be taught. And this ideology goes everywhere from when we are in elementary school, we're taught certain things like civics and math and writing, all the things that we believe everyone should know. That is institutionalized, right? It is not just a general thing that everybody should know, but it is a conscious decision by people to do those things. Right, so education is one of those institutions. Religion, again, one of those institutions that sort of instills a sense of morals and values that people should have, and they they pass on from generation to generation. And when they do, they keep pushing those things along. Corporations are the same way. They create products or some sort of service that is generally agreed upon that people are going to use and that they're going to consume. And then when those products change, right, there can be a shift in power and how that power gets observed, right? For instance, and let's take a look at transportation. Now, if we go back 100, 120 years, the major mode of transportation in the United States was horse and buggy, right? If you're going to be doing any sort of traveling between places, you're probably going to do it that way. You know, trains had definitely become a bigger part of that, but the automobile hadn't really taken hold. Right? And there was a lot of resistance against the automobile. It's more expensive. It needs a unique fuel that hasn't been sort of commercialized enough so that you could go anywhere you wanted to. You had to stay in certain places that had access to that fuel, right? Where a horse, and wherever there's grass, you can go. And so there was this big issue that, folks that prevailed through the industry of owning horses and taking care of horses and having stables in the city where you could, put your horse and have them taken care of while you were shopping or doing whatever it is that you needed to do, so that when you decided to leave, you could hop back on your horse and head back out home. Right, so we can kind of look at that, but there was also a lot of pollution that came with horses, right? Horses crap everywhere, right? And it's just what horses do. And there used to be issues. There was a whole industry that revolved around people going out and cleaning up after those horses, right? Just imagine being in, say, like downtown Denver, and in Denver, you'd have horses and buggies and moving people around and commodities, and just having piles of manure all over the place. Somebody had to clean that up. And that was an industry, that was a job that people had to do. So when that became threatened with cars, right, there was resistance. We can look at modern day issues as well, sort of a shift from going from automobiles to electronic vehicles, right, EVs. So we can compare how institutions change over time depending on the influence, right? Changing on technology, changing on the need for that technology, right? You can cross the country on a horse. You can do it a heck of a lot quicker in a car, right? So the need for that started to shift. And all those industries started reacting in different ways. And it created different power structures and different ways of influencing people. So whether or not you agree with, keeping cars with internal combustion engines versus buying a Tesla and having it battery powered, is really sort of the same sort of issue that we've been dealing with within lots of different institutions, but transportation itself for a long time, looking at different ways, different means of doing that kind of stuff. Okay. We also look at things like government. That should be pretty obvious, both local and national style governments. So within the United States, we have the federal government, we have state, and we have local. Each one of those sort of mirrors the next one, right? So federal governments, we've got president, we have Congress and the Supreme Court. But if we go down to the state, right, we have governors, we have state Congress, and we have state courts, right? And then we go even further, right? In the local, you have your mayor, you might have a city council, and again, you might have like a city court system. So our society has been modeled in this way so that we recognize, right, this particular person, this particular position has the same role, both local, state, and federal, right? So we can organize around that, right? We don't have to change up to look at, local politics and how it might be totally different than, say, state or federal. But of course, not all communities and cultures do the same thing, right? Sometimes they do something different. They are looking at maybe not having that mayor or that president or that one particular chief, but maybe that organization is situational, right? Whoever is, if we're looking at, say, nomadic cultures, whoever is the best fisherman is in charge of fishing. Whoever is the best weaver is in charge of creating textiles, right? So maybe it becomes sort of a meritocracy. Whoever is the best actually gets to do sort of the being in charge thing, right? We talked a little bit about religion, the control of values and morals within a culture. Religion is particularly powerful, and we'll talk about that when we get to our religious section and why it's so important. And then what other kinds of power and institutions might we look at, right? Obviously, mass media, that influence, can be really important to consider, right? How do we consume that media? What kinds of access do you have? If we're thinking about, say, things like social media has a lot of power, but it impacts different populations differently. Younger people are connected through social media in lots of different ways, where older generations might not be. And if they're not, then they might be missing out on a lot of the important discussions that are happening with the larger and newer youth population, right? So there can be a disconnect between those different age groups, right? Just based on that. And then there's also access through the economy, right? Can you afford to have that fancy new cell phone or to have a computer or to be able to put yourself on to social media to become that influencer? Do you have access to those resources, right? So that's also important to think about. Okay, so let's talk about this concept of hegemony, okay? And hegemony is sort of the cultural powerhouse. And there are very few cultures in the world that really have this concept of hegemony. The United States is the big one. Great Britain is also a large hegemonic force. It has been shrinking quite a bit, but it still has a big impact. China is gathering a large hegemonic force. Even places like Japan, which is such a small country, but they export culture. And that's really what we're talking about, is cultural influence. Now, we have to distinguish when it comes to power the martial powers and the hegemonic powers. The martial powers is that the use of force, right? The military, police, economics, the use of banks and money, controlling those funds that people have access to. And then politics, right? Politics is creating laws that are enforced, upon you, right? You have to do this, you have to do that, and if you don't do those things, then there could be some sort of a punishment, right? And that punishment could be jail or worse. So those are the martial powers, right? That hegemonic power is now looking at cultural influence and wanting people to create change without being forced to do so. And this is why the United States is one of those few countries that has a true hegemonic force, because our influence has been going outside of our borders, and other countries throughout the entire world have been seeing what Americans have been doing and like it. They like what they're seeing, right? They watch American television and they want more, right? They watch American movies, they wear American clothing, right? Blue jeans have gone all around the world, right? And became a huge commodity. We wouldn't think about blue jeans as being a world influence, but it has. So all of these things, these cultural things, music, right? When I was in Kenya, one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating was that there was American music everywhere, right? Any restaurant or store you went in, when I was taking a bus from Nairobi to Mombasa, there was American music, American movies that were being played on that bus. So that influence was there. Everywhere I looked, I'd see T-shirts, and it was all in English. Right? You'd see a T-shirt and it'd have something scrawled along the top, and it was in the English. And the back of every bus or tuk-tuk, you know, you'd have like Beyonce, and a tuk-tuk is a motorcycle, sort of like taxi. And on the back it would say like Beyonce or Jordan or Jay-Z, you know, and you have this cultural force that's going out that is influencing behavior, influencing what people are living like, their clothing, the things that they find to be important in their lives are being influenced by outside sources. And they want that, right? They see it as better than whatever it is that they're doing. And that's the thing about hegemonic forces, is it draws people in to you, right? If you're the dominant culture, it's bringing people in. And this can be a huge impact on different populations, especially as they are dealing with their own culture being challenged, right? Maybe they're not, maybe their culture, their language is disappearing. Right? If we take a look at, like, say, India, right? In different places around India, then English has become one of the adopted national languages. Initially because of the British, as they colonized and really sort of influenced and dominated India. That influence, even though the Marshall influence left, right, and the colonial aspect sort of left, that cultural influence stayed. And even today we're seeing that kids are being sent to boarding school so that they can learn English, so that they can get a job in which they will be servicing English speakers. There are more people in India that speak English than there are English speakers in the United States. And let me say that again. There are more people in India that speak English, the English language, than there are people who speak English in the United States. That's absolutely mind-boggling, right? And it's because that English language, that Western culture has had such a huge influence on that country that it is seen as, you know, economically imperative that people learn that language so that they can get jobs dealing with Westerners, right? That's hegemonic forces at work, okay? And even institutions like Bollywood, right? Bollywood being comparative to Hollywood in California. Bollywood puts out, I think, 3 to 4 times as many films a year as Hollywood does. And their audience is much larger than Hollywood has as individuals within, say, like the United States. But Hollywood still has a broader audience when it comes to global viewership, right? People around the world are watching Hollywood films that have been, dubbed in 30 or 40 different languages so that it can be viewed around the world. Again, that's the difference between something like Hollywood and Bollywood as two different institutions essentially doing the same thing. So, right, hegemony is it's a big issue that we have to contend with, especially when dealing with the United States, and how other countries do that. We also see that even within our own culture, that hegemonic force, sort of keeps us going, to believing the things that we do. It reinforces those ideologies of like, oh, everyone is consuming what we're doing, so what we're doing must be the best. And hegemonic forces don't always work like that. It doesn't always say that, this is the best way to do it, but it's basically saying that we believe that this is the best way of doing it, and we're going to show everyone this is how it should be done. And then everyone goes like, yeah, we sort of agree with that, even if it might not be. And that's one of the reasons why we really look at other cultures and want to understand those other cultures, to see what it is that they are bringing to the table, right? What are the things that they are engaging with? And so that's one of the reasons why we go out there and look at other cultures, to see what they're doing and why they're doing it. One of the indicators that we see oftentimes used is for hegemonic forces is like the American dream. And the American dream is interesting because not everybody experiences the American dream the same way, right? We all think about it as sort of like the same thing, but it really isn't, because different populations are going to see it differently. If you talk about the American dream and you're in a wealthy part of the United States that is possibly more liberal, you're going to see a reaction that, hey, the American dream is false, right? It doesn't fit everybody. Not everybody can obtain it. If you look at different parts of the population, especially in rural communities, that American dream is, it is something to behold. It is something to adhere to. It is what drives you to do more, be better. And then you might go outside of the country and people see the American dream and they might see it completely different. We talk about the land of opportunity, but our ideas of opportunity and their ideas of opportunity might be distinctly different, right? Might be very different. And we might experience it differently because we have access to resources, right? You can go out and get that job, but that job might be, working at McDonald's, right? You might get that, low entry job into corporate America, and you might find yourself working that way, your way up the corporate ladder. But the American dream can also look like an immigrant or a migrant worker, coming to the United States, working on a farm or in a pasture or in a orchard, gathering resources, gathering those, potatoes and grapes and oranges and all of those things. And then being able to make enough money to be able to send home so that, their families can support themselves and can do all these things that they might not have had access to at home, or they believe that they can come here and make a new safe home. Maybe, the United States, we talk a lot about security issues, but it's not as bad as some other places, right? And so people see the American dream and they're like, I can be safe there. I can I can make a life for myself and for my family, and I can bring my family over. And that's the interesting thing about the American dream, is it can be viewed from all of these different perspectives. And that's something about culture that we want to understand. Why do different cultures see these concepts as possibly being different, right? It all depends on where you come from, right? What is your local culture look like? And how is that going to influence it? Because when we think about freedom, when we think about free speech, when we think about all of those sort of ideological aspects of our society, and sometimes we get into fights over them because you believe it's this and somebody else believes it's that, and there's a little bit of a contest there, right, to determine what is true. And the reality is that they're both right. We have to understand those perspectives, right, to better understand where these folks are coming from. Let's see. Okay, so human agency. Now, human agency is one of those things that we are going to talk a little bit about, because we talk a lot about culture, but we also have to understand how that culture gets changed, how it gets modified. And that's where we're talking about human agency. Hegemonic forces, this huge cultural influence that, one country might have over others, it seems like a lot, right? But human agency is this ability for the individual to act, right? And act within their culture to create change, if there is that desire for change to take place. An individual, isn't going to make a big change, but those individuals coming together and talking about it can then create that kind of change. So you can have this sort of force of will, right, to make those changes, and we see that taking place all the time. That's how culture changes. We practiced slavery. It was completely legal to have a slave. In fact, it was morally and ethically acceptable and lawful to own another human being. And this was the standard for 400 years in North America, right? Slavery lasted for 400 years. So when we look at that, we know that it was acceptable by this group of people until it wasn't. Until there was enough people that said, this kind of behavior we don't agree with, right? We don't want this to happen anymore. And a war was fought over it. Same way if we look at civil rights, right? Segregation was totally acceptable, was totally legal to be able to segregate people, African Americans from white schools, right? You couldn't attend. It was totally legal to make that. It was totally legal for you to go into a neighborhood, say you're an African American family and you wanted to go buy a home. You could be discriminated against and not sold a home if that particular neighborhood said, we don't want you here. Totally legal, right? Until it wasn't, until enough people spoke up and the majority started to say, you know what, enough is enough. We don't want this anymore. Okay, that's human agency. That's that capability of will to challenge previously established ideologies and practices. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, right? If we go back in time, a few years ago, we had that sort of like neo-Nazi event in Charlottesville, right? Where you had white supremacists come out and they're chanting and they're marching and they are acting upon their agency, right? Actively trying to create change and awareness for an ideology that they believe in. And then you had other people that said, we don't believe in this and we don't want that to take place here. And while they were enacting their agency, they were being opposed by that larger population, that those values were very different from those white supremacists and neo-Nazis, right? So agency can have the same effect, either working or not working. You know, you get enough people that start to believe in something, and then you can create change. And at the same time, you can see flare-ups every once in a while in which that change that someone might want to have doesn't have the backing, right? So that's something to consider when you're thinking about human agency and what people are capable of doing and creating that sort of change. Okay, so stepping aside from sort of that cultural look, one of the things that we also have to consider when we're looking at groups of people is how do we develop, right? So we're going to talk about nature and nurture, or is it nature versus nurture, right? And again, it depends on your perspective. Throughout our development as a nation, we have oftentimes separated culture from nature, okay? And what a lot of science is looking at now, and especially anthropology, is that it's really a combination, right? It's nature and it's nurture. It's how people grow up in a particular place, and the biological aspects of it that also help to influence cultural behavior. And that cultural behavior can also influence that natural development. And to do this, we have to include the environment, right? It's not just the biological influence of the parents, but it's also the environmental impact of the clean air, the healthy food, clean water. Those kinds of things can also have a big impact on the development of a culture. You know, if we think about if we grow up in a place where there's, say, dirty water, right? You know, and so you're drinking a lot of dirty water. That's impacting the plants that you're growing, which is also going to impact the animals that you might be using to feed upon. That water is going to be hurting that community through illness. You're going to have less productivity, and then that can also have biological impacts for later generations, right? If you are unhealthy as a mother, then you are more likely to have unhealthy kids because they're not getting the resources. They might be their immune systems might be more susceptible, right? So the environment can have a big impact on that. And we know that, you know, if you have a lot of protein, the more protein you eat, the bigger you get, right? Because that protein is those building blocks that a human body needs to gain in size. You know, so folks that are oftentimes eating a lot of, you know, animal protein as a big staple also have a tendency to be pretty big. Versus other things like fish protein, which doesn't quite do the same thing, or plant proteins. Still healthy, but it has different impacts. So we can look at how food impacts bodies and how those can be generationally important to understand. And then we look at, you know, sort of the environmental factors, right? What is it like to be living in a mountain culture? You know, what kind of impacts might you have here? If you grew up in Colorado and you sort of adopted that and say you're athletic, and then you go someplace else to be an athlete. You go to you know, the coast, right, sea level. Well, your body is acclimated to that higher altitude, which is going to change the impact that oxygen has on your body. Now, of course, that acclimation, humans acclimate really quick to just about every environment that they can get themselves into, and their body acclimates pretty quick. So it can be within days, if not weeks, that you become accustomed to that new environment, which is one of the interesting traits that humans have, is that ability to adjust. Um, so, but it also culturally becomes a part of your identity, right? The things that you do, the things that you have access to, the types of food that you're going to eat, the types of media that you enjoy. You might find things that are more relatable to you, to be more important than something that is, a little bit more foreign to you, right? We might like more stories about the mountains versus more stories about the ocean because we don't have that relatability to it, right? So that relatability to different ideas becomes really important to understanding how geographical location and the environment that you grow up in becomes really important, and how it sets priorities within people's lives. Um, and as we've sort of been researching this, right, we've come to understand that as science has been developing, we're getting closer and closer to understanding how each individual gene works within the body and what it turns on and what it turns off. But it's still extremely complicated. We don't have the best picture of that. Um, and if we did, we could fix all kinds of issues, right? We could stop all kinds of diseases if we knew exactly which switches to throw. But we don't, right? And one of the important things to think about this as well, is how we as individuals, as biological entities, we can go anywhere around the world. We can, say you take a child, let's take a child from the United States and put them into another culture, say in Africa, or so we'll just go to Kenya again. And in Kenya, this child is going to grow up around Kenyans, right? And it's going to learn a language. They're going to learn the history. They're going to learn all the cultural practices that that community embodies, right? So they might be from another part of the world altogether, but what they're primarily going to do is they're going to learn about their identity through that culture, right? So we know from this that culture is extremely important to how an individual comes about, right? Because we can take anyone from anywhere around the world, especially kids, put them into a new environment, and they will develop within that environment. And even doing things like losing accents, right? If they speak their language but they have to learn a new one, eventually they will lose their old accent and adapt into that new society so that they can become a part of that society. So, this is important for us to understand. And then when we think about culture as well, we're oftentimes challenged with this concept of what is normal versus what is strange, right? We see things as normal because we grow up in that culture. That is how everyone behaves. And then we have to, when we go someplace else and they do something strange, it doesn't make sense, right? And that kind of stuff can be, kind of scary, right? And challenging sometimes. So again, this is what I was talking about just a moment ago. Again, you can take anyone from anywhere, put them into that new culture, and then that becomes the norm, right? The things that they learn there, that becomes the normal. And so, it doesn't have anything to do with your biology, right? It all depends on culture. There are going to be biological things that might influence you to certain behaviors, But how those behaviors get expressed is going to be culturally driven. And then culture can definitely impact our physical development, right? Again, it's sort of like our behaviors in food, our health, all of those things can change how we develop as a species, as a group of people. You know, looking at health. If you look at the United States, look at fast food, right, and obesity, and that can also be connected to things like poverty, ease of access to resources, right? As going to the store becomes more and more expensive, people are finding that it's almost the same price as going to the store to buy healthy food as it is to buy, junk food. So, right, and there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into that we have to take a look at. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the semester. Then we have things like consumerism, right? Consumerism is interesting because we are dominated by it as a culture, right? Especially Americans, we consume everything, right? That's who we are. Whether it's consuming education, whether it's consuming entertainment or food or clothing or whatever it is that we need, it's all connected to consumption. It drives our economy. It drives our values, right? Oftentimes our values are connected to those exact same things. We then have to look at things like the American dream, right? The American dream is connected to consumerism, right? That might be having that big house, right? Having that white picket fence, and I'm talking about like 1950s era American ideology. Having 2.4 kids, having that dog and cat, keeping up with the Joneses. And if you don't know what that term means, basically it's like saying, I want to be able to keep up with my neighbors. When they buy a new car, I should get a new car. If they get a new computer, I need a new computer so that I can say that, I'm just as successful as you are, right? And that also leads to things like debt, right? And so, when we get into that part of our semester, we'll go more deeply into that concept. And then we see things like advertising, right? Advertising is everywhere. Everything we do circles around advertising. You consume media and you're being advertised to. If you go out and eat or you're looking for food, you're going to see billboards that are connected to it. Your clothing, half the time your clothing is advertising for your clothing, right? So advertising is everywhere, and its influence on how we look at things. When I was working with the graffiti community a number of years back, one of the things that we were talking about, and was kind of a big concern, was that graffiti had been at this one point as an art form this rebellious act, right? It was this process of going out and staking your name out there, putting it out there, and getting recognition for it, or you've got a message and you put that message out. And that's really important to sort of understand, right? That is something that as a community, you can get your word out, you can get that recognition. However, what ended up happening is that artwork started getting noticed, and all of a sudden people started liking to see it, right? That's why if you go to, say like downtown Denver, go to Rhino, at Rhino you can see all of this graffiti that's out there that is, in fact they have a yearly festival, Orange Crush, in which people from all around the world come and paint on those alley walls, and then they stay there all year to be admired, and then they come back and do it over again. And it's this shift from seeing graffiti as being this detrimental, um, ultimately destructive art form to being something that is influencing, consumerism, right? You look at certain products like, for instance, like Mountain Dew, right? Mountain Dew took a lot of its design from graffiti writers, right? And you start seeing that in clothing. You start seeing that in commodities that people can buy, right? They started improving the variety of colors in paint cans, right? So that you can get all these different colors. It wasn't just for having the diversity of color, but that graffiti actually influenced that consumption, right? And the need for variety, right? So it's had this continual influence, but it was partially due to consumerism, right? I knew a guy that was living in Hollywood, and he was a graffiti writer, and he got the opportunity to do some graffiti on the set of a movie that was being done. And so when the day came, he goes down there, and they say, okay, on this wall we want to do some graffiti. So he goes up and starts painting, and the director comes up and says, hey, what are you doing? And the guy was like, I'm doing graffiti. Now the concept between that graffiti writer and the director were two different concepts, right? The director had this very specific idea about what that graffiti should look like, but he just went and hired a graffiti artist to do what he assumed that graffiti artist was going to do. And it wasn't the same. And so there was conflict between the producer of this art form versus the producer of a different type of medium who had different expectations, right? So again, conflict in how this art form is being used, consumed, and then put out there for the masses, right? So if the producer is saying, hey, or director is saying, hey, we don't want this type of artwork, we want this type of artwork, that's changing how it's going to become consumed and become appropriate, right? Okay, so something to think about, doing an exercise here. I want you guys to think of something that influences culture through advertising or multimedia and why it was successful or unsuccessful. So basically come up with two different ideas about what has been successful and what hasn't been successful. So for instance, I'll use two different examples, and we'll go into politics, right? The MAGA hat, right? That red hat that Trump supporters always wear. Now, when it comes down to advertising and when it comes to the effectiveness of this hat, it is absolutely brilliant, right? Anytime you see a red hat, you have to question yourself, or at least I do, is that a MAGA hat, right? Make America Great Again. And that has a lot of cultural power, right? It has a lot of influence. And making America great again can mean two totally different things to two different groups, right? And so that advertisement, whether or not you agree with the politics, that method of getting that word out, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. You look back at Obama and his posters, right? Do you remember the poster where it says, like, it's got a picture of him and he's like in this tri-colored poster, and underneath it says hope, right? It says hope. And that got a lot of use, right? Really good use. But what if I told you that both the Obama hope poster and the MAGA hat are doing the exact same thing? and that they are banking on the concept of hope, right? Hope for future, right? It all depends on whose future are you talking about. What side of the political playground are you on? And so when you think about that, when you think about these concepts of like hope, right, that becomes a currency. And so, we know that was, both of those were very successful because they were both playing to the same sort of concept of hope as being something that we should be striving for, right? But it might look different to different people. And then you can look at unsuccessful, right? What is something that you might have seen that didn't work out? I think of like Crystal Pepsi, right? I don't know if you've ever had Crystal Pepsi. It wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. But the marketing for it was pretty terrible. And it never caught on. And they bring it back every few years just to, tease us with something that didn't work, to see if they can't get it to work now, but it doesn't work. So, right, something to consider. Think about it, write it down, and come up with a couple of good ideas. Okay, so globalization and culture, we've been talking a lot about this. We really need to focus on things like acculturation. That's where you are basically living that hegemonic experience, right? Acculturation is that overexerting cultural force moving in on you, and instead of you living your traditional life, your traditional values, and you're actually learning about someone else's culture, and it's coming in and becoming a part of your own. This happens a lot on like Native American communities, in which Western culture is coming in and having more and more influence. Sometimes, certainly in the past, through that martial influence through the military and through force, but also now through culture. Kids are experiencing television and movies and radio, and it's challenging traditional experiences. And so when we look at that, it's a big issue. So we really have to pay attention to this process of what's happening around the world. Hegemonic forces themselves, when we think about sort of modern ideas around that, have really been focused around the United States post-World War II. World War II was sort of like the United States coming out party as being both dominant in a martial way, militarily, but then also culturally, as everybody wanted to have American stuff. And that just started pushing throughout the entire world, where everybody started getting American things. With globalization as well, we've talked a little bit about immigration and migration, and this is also really important to think about. The difference between immigration and migration is that immigration is usually someone moving from one place to another place permanently, while migration is a cyclical pattern in which you live here, but you work here, and then you go back here, and then you go back here, and you go back here, and it becomes a cycle. So we have lots of migrant workers that come into the United States to do jobs, and then they will go home when the job is over. Immigrants will leave their land and then come to another land and live there permanently. And we have a lot of that in the United States. But that happens a lot around the world, and is becoming even more and more practiced as we look at the ease of travel in which globalization is affording different people. And we also see different reasons why people are moving, right? A lot of times it can be down to Again, that hegemonic force. We see people that are living a particular way that we want to live. And so we try and emulate that or go to where that place is. Or we might be pushed out, right? Natural disaster or warfare or something like that, in which populations are forced to move and move to a new location, right? So there's a dual sort of like push and pull reason why people are immigrating or migrating. And then we need to talk about sort of this process in which people are moving as they're immigrating or migrating to new places. We have this issue in which people are moving more and more often from rural communities to larger communities, big cities. And there's a number of reasons for this, right? If you look at a lot of rural communities today, they don't have the same sort of resources. They don't have the education, they don't have the entertainment, the opportunity, and the jobs are oftentimes pretty difficult, right? Living life as a farmer is not always easy, right? It's one of those jobs that, if you're dealing with animals, you don't take days off, right? Because those animals still need to be fed, they still need to be taken care of. And so those kinds of jobs are being taken over more and more by corporations, and people that are living in those small communities, rural communities, are moving to larger communities, bigger cities. And this creates an issue because we're seeing this change in cultural behavior, right? As people are moving to bigger cities, they're adjusting to bigger city life. When we look at sort of the politics of big city versus rural communities, we see that rural communities have a tendency to be more conservative, bigger cities have a tendency to be more liberal, and that's because you're influenced by more and different things, right? There's more people living there, and so you're going to be learning about different cultures and different communities, and have access to a broader range of knowledge than you would in a rural community. And it's just because there's that influence, right? So that's changing how our country is viewing itself, right? And that's that perspective that isn't always shared or agreed upon. But we're seeing this shift from rural to urban. And that's creating a lot of different issues that we'll be talking about throughout the semester. And so communication and transportation also has a big part in this as well, right? Being able to move to a big city, right? Again, 100 years ago, it would have been a pretty big deal for you to move across country, right? To move from, say, Chicago to Los Angeles. That was a big deal. Now, it's a piece of cake, right? Most people have cars. You can load up your car and then just drive and be there in a few days, or take a train or a bus or moving company or whatever, right? Becomes super easy to do. And because of that, our ability to shift locations, to move, to either take our stuff with us or discard it and get new stuff at our next destination, means that our ability to travel and resettle is super easy. And then that also changes, again, those education patterns. We're seeing a shift from religious folks living in cities that's starting to diminish versus in rural communities where being religious is still very strong. And that's because there's lots of stuff going on in the cities that is distracting from being in church. So you've got other ideas, other possibilities, other religions that you can explore, and if you don't like it, you can go do something else, right? And you also don't have the same cultural pressures, right? You live in that rural community, if everybody goes to church and you don't show up, you get that pressure to show up. You live in a big city, you're not going to get that same pressure because you don't have to see those people on a regular basis, right? So there's lots of different reasons why we might be seeing this sort of change. And again, we'll talk more about that later on. Another exercise, what would be some of the benefits and drawbacks to moving to the big city, right? And what are some of the environmental effects? And I think this is important to think about, right? There are benefits, better education, or more access to education, I should say. Not always necessarily better, because it's just, that's sort of an ethnocentric approach to education. So we're looking at more access to various types of education, more access to different careers, more access to resources, and that's why some of the benefits of going to a big city are there. Some of the drawbacks is losing cultural identity, right? That rural community that, might be small and fairly unique, as people leave, they also lose that identity and morph into that larger identity of the big city. And if you're doing this coming from one language to another language, then there's a good chance that your family and subsequent generations are going to lose that traditional language and those traditional practices. So that can definitely be something bad, right? And then the environmental effects. When we move to larger cities, there's a lot of consumption, right? And so that can be kind of a big issue. Where rural communities, there's still a lot of consumption, but oftentimes it's a little bit more environmentally aware, depending on the situation. At the same time, rural communities also take a look at those resources and see them as plentiful, right? If you live in an area where there's lots of trees, it's like, well, those trees are resources. Do I need to keep them? I could sell them off. That's an issue to consider. Okay, so that's sort of a conclusion to this lecture. We talked about how certain ideas, right? Norms, values, symbols, mental maps, our material culture sort of influence how we organize the world, how we adapt to the world, how we adapt to each other, and how we relate to each other, how we see and observe the world and decide how our culture is going to behave given any circumstance. We've looked at different ways in which we've sort of studied it, right? We looked at social Darwinism and how that sort of process of connecting biology to culture really isn't appropriate because it doesn't work. And why when we saw some of the earliest folks within modern anthropology, Boas and Malinowski, as they looked at cultures, they were like, we don't necessarily need to say which one is better, which one is worse, but how does it work, right? What is best suited for its environment, and how does it sustain itself in a way that someone new coming in might not be able to just adapt as easily to it. We've also talked about culture and power and how those dynamics can be very fluid, can be very sort of just ingrained into our normal everyday lives, that we might not notice it, but it's still there, it still exists. And so paying attention to that is really important. We talked about hegemonic forces, martial forces, and how those influences can take us from one place to another place, and how it can bring people across borders and why they would want to do that, right? What are the things that drive people to behave a certain way, especially when their current way might not be good enough for them, or they perceive that it's not, right? They might be willing to give up that culture and move to the big city if they perceive the idea that they will have better opportunity, right? That American dream of being able to create your own destiny. right? We've talked about how culture isn't necessarily created, but it's always being modified. It's always changing. It's never static, and that's really important to understand. Is that change is always taking place. And really, one of the big things that we have talked about is the fact that globalism is it's really important to pay attention to, because it's having more and more of an effect on people's lives. When we look at communities around us, guess what? They are being impacted by the globalization process, by other peoples, by corporations, by governments, right? All of those things are having impacts on people. And, that globalization is also going to include climate, right? As climate change is taking place, understanding how that's going to impact people and their behavior. Okay, that's it. So for this, again, you'll have a short exam to take for this series of lectures. I'll also set up a sort of a discussion area so that if you have comments, say from like your exercises, that you would like to comment on something and have people comment back, it's a great place for you to actually have a discussion. Even though this is an asynchronous course, this might be a place for you to actually, have a conversation, talk about it. Okay, that's it. We will see you for the next lecture, and good luck.